It's time for us to look at one of the most difficult subjects in all of jiu-jitsu to teach. This is the subject of guard retention. Guard retention is a skill so critical to the foundation of our sport, and yet at the same time, so difficult to actually teach to a student. Why? Because the very nature of guard play between my attempts to attack from bottom and my opponent's attempt to pass from on top is very fast changing, very dynamic, with a lot of variables thrown into the equation. As a result, we can only give rather broad advice. We can't give precise step-by-step advice as we can in more controlled, more static situations in the sport. When it comes time to look at guard retention, I like to divide approaches into it into two broad areas. The first, and the one I want you focusing on the most, is a general system of guard retention. This is an approach based around principles and concepts. It gives you the tactical flexibility required to deal with the often chaotic and dynamic nature of guard passing. This stands in contrast to the traditional method of teaching guard retention, which is the specific guard pass method. Here, the student is taught to recognize what method of guard pass is being used against them and to counter that specific method of guard pass with a specific set of moves designed to overcome the various weaknesses of that guard passing method. I want you to put your primary emphasis upon a general system of guard retention, which is designed to allow you to defend against any form of guard pass along general broad principles, rather than a specific method based on countering a specific form of guard pass with specific moves. I will teach you both. I believe there's good and bad to both, but as a general mode of operations, I want you focusing first and mostly upon a general guard retention system. So let's talk about what this general guard retention system is. It begins with the notion of offensive and defensive cycles. You will notice that whenever you go to use guard position, there are times you are attacking and there are times you are desperately defending against your opponent's passes. I can say that I'm in an offensive cycle when I have a strong mechanical connection to my opponent through grips with my hands and my feet that enable me to break his balance, enter into the various forms of attacks from bottom, and prevent my opponent from creating any kind of angle or distance to pass my guard. Remember that every form of guard pass requires some kind of angle and distance on the part of my opponent. If I'm strongly connected to my opponent and they go to move, I will move with them, and it will be very hard for them to gain distance and angle upon me. A defensive cycle occurs when my opponent has broken my connection to him to a degree where he can begin to create angle and distance upon me. A key skill for the student to develop is to be able to recognize immediately when they are in a defensive cycle and when they are in an offensive cycle. Remember that the transition between these two can be very subtle and it can happen very quickly. The number one error that I see in beginning students in jiu-jitsu when it's time to retain guard is that they tend to confuse offensive and defensive cycles, and they will attack when they should be defending. They will attack while they're in what is truly a defensive cycle, and they will defend when they should be in an offensive cycle. This confusion needs to be eliminated. Understand from the start that the general system is a heuristic system. It is not an algorithmic one. Many of the systems I teach are very much algorithmic because the scenario is heavily controlled. For example, if I'm on my opponent's back, my opponent really can't move that much, and as a result, we can go through a simple step-by-step method to get to a finish. Guard play is not like that. The overall position is so fast-moving, so filled with rapid changes in position, that it's impossible to give a simple step-by-step system, an algorithmic system. So what we can offer is heuristic principles. and skills, which will give you a broad map of what you're trying to do. And this will be the most effective way for you to work when you go to work to retain your guard against your opponent's passing attempts. Understand that everything begins when we switch from an offensive cycle into a defensive cycle. If my opponent manages to break my connection, or even just reduce it to a degree where my legs are no longer in contact with my opponent or the ground, this means my opponent is capable of getting into an advantageous angle and closing distance upon me. Given that my opponent now has this tactical advantage, they will begin a passing sequence. So what do I need then to retain my guard once my connection to my opponent has been reduced to a degree where they can start going into guard passing offense? Let's start by talking about the straightforward components of my guard retention system. The first element are a set of physical skills. There are 3 physical skills that form the core of my guard retention system. And indeed, I believe most high-level athletes' approach to retaining guard. The first, and arguably the most important, are postural skills. There are 3 postures associated with guard retention more than any other. These are seated postures, supine postures, where you are on your back, and turtle postures, where you are on your knees and elbows. Guard retention is really all about the interplay of these 3 postures under pressure. As a developing student, you must be able to flow between seated, supine, and turtle postures using the body movements that I will soon outline. You'll have to be able to do this against strong pressure on the part of your opponent. And while you use these 3 postures, seated, supine, and turtle, you must be able to keep your knees to your chest and your elbows to your knees. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. When it comes time to understanding the postural skills of guard retention, there are 3 postures that we work with more than any other: seated postures, supine postures, and turtle postures. And we must be able to flow between those 3 seamlessly and effectively. While we flow between those 3 postures, we must be able to maintain our knees to our chest and our elbows to our knees. The more my knees drift away from my chest and the more my elbows drift away from my knees, the easier it will become for my opponent to pass my guard. The second set of skills required in the guard retention system are movement skills. I can teach you guard retention moves all day, but if you don't have the prerequisite movement skills to actually be able to perform them, none of that will do any good whatsoever. I believe there are 10 core movement skills which stand out and which form the vast majority of the body movements required for good guard retention. These are, in no particular order: pommeling your legs, scissoring, hip heisting, back heisting, rolling, sitting, inverting, shrimping. Please note there are 3 different types of shrimp used: sliding shrimps, power shrimps, and reverse shrimps, scooting, and propping. So that's 10 different body skills. Don't worry, I will show what these movement skills are in extreme detail as the video progresses. The third physical skill that you will have to master is the skill of framing. Frames are temporary barriers designed to maintain space with your upper body when your opponent has passed your lower body. They hold their ground just long enough for you to recover your lower body, that is your legs, as your opponent goes into their passes. There are 3 main forms of framing in my guard passing system. These are forehand frames, where we use our hands and the length of our arms as our long distance barrier. Then we have forearm frames, where the forearm is used as the barrier between myself and my opponent. And thirdly, there are backhand frames, where the backs of my hand are presented to my opponent, and these form the, as it were, last-ditch frames when our opponent's gotten very close to us. The key feature of frames is that they work with variable distance. The three main kinds of frames that we work with, forehand, forearm, and backhand, work at various distances. The forehand frames are the long distance barriers. The forearm frames are the medium distance barriers, and the backhand frames are the very close barriers between myself and my opponent. We must be able to take the correct frame based on the distance between myself and my opponent and apply it in a guard retention scenario. Frames work primarily by either preventing level changes on the part of my opponent to come down and pin me chest to chest, and by protecting my head from being controlled by my opponent as they go into their passing sequences. They create a temporary barrier that enables me to prevent my opponent closing distance, and as a consequence, I can recover my legs and recover my guard. So those are the three main physical skills in the guard retention system. Now let's talk about the three main tactical skills. These are the skills I really want you to spend a considerable amount of time and energy learning and understanding. These are the heart and soul of guard retention. Interestingly, they are almost never taught, and yet they form the absolute basis of your ability to hold guard against a strong passer. The first tactical skill you must develop is the ability to assess the degree of threat posed by the guard pass your opponent is using. So our first skill is threat assessment skills. A guard pass attempt can be more or less threatening depending upon how far it has proceeded. We don't want to underreact to a genuine danger, and we don't want to overreact to a superficial danger. We need a simple guide to tell us how much danger we are in and what the appropriate reaction should be. The way this is done is through my use of demarcation lines. There are 4 horizontal lines across the human body: the toe line, the knee line, the hip line, and the shoulder line. And these give us a very clear sense of distance between myself and my opponent. There is also 3 vertical lines running through the body: the center line, and the left sideline, and the right sideline. These are responsible for understanding the angle between myself and my opponent. The single most important notion here is what I often refer to as the jeopardy point. This is the intersection of the hip line and the sideline. If your opponent can get to this jeopardy point, where your hip line and sideline intersect, you are now 100% defensive. You are in a defensive cycle from where all of your reactions ought to be defensive reactions until you can regain alignment with your opponent's center line. The second tactical skill that you must master in this guard retention system is appropriate reaction skills. Your opponent's trying to pass your guard, and you have to react to that. It's important that you react in the appropriate fashion. The centerpiece of appropriate reaction skills comes in the 5 requirements theory. My belief is that there are 5 basic requirements that my opponent must satisfy if he is to pass my guard. The first is that he must have some kind of grip upon me. Second, he must be able to establish some kind of angle upon me. That is, he must be able to step outside of my sideline. He also must be able to close distance. In other words, he must be able to get past my hip line. Fourthly, he must be able to change levels so that his chest comes down to my chest and establishes a pin. And fifth and finally, he must be able to pin me effectively on the mat for a period of at least 3 seconds, where one of my shoulders is pinned down to the floor. So there are 5 things your opponent needs to pass your guard: grip, angle, distance, level change, and pin. If he cannot satisfy all 5 of those actions, he will not pass your guard. Your job as the guard retainer is to fight your opponent on all 5 of those basic core requirements in a sequence. Understand that the 5 requirements are sequential: grip first, angle second, distance third, level change fourth, and pin fifth. Once you understand these 5 requirements, you will understand that you can fight him in all 5 steps of the way. How you fight is based upon how many of those steps your opponent has made. When he's simply got a grip on you, you can often thwart him by breaking grips initially and holding your opponent off just with simple grip denial. Once your opponent starts getting angled, the simple action of realigning your body through shrimping or scooting will often keep your opponent in front of you and prevent guard passes. Things get more problematic when your opponent starts closing distance on you. If he has distance and angle, that's a serious problem. And now you start need to go into your frames, and those frames will hold him off long enough for you to recover your legs. Things get still more interesting when your opponent begins level changing down. Now, your opponent's starting to put you under severe pressure, and at this point, more extreme actions, such as inversions, may be required to put your opponent back in guard. By the time your opponent gets to the 5th and final element, the pin, you are now in a crisis situation, and your responses will have to reflect that. You will have to take greater risks at this point. Now you'll be going into your backhand frames. You'll be trying to sit up off the mat and get shoulders off the floor. There may even be some degree of back exposure on your part to prevent the pin from happening. The idea is that as your opponent gets further and further into the 5 steps of guard passing, you will have to take greater and greater risks to prevent the points being scored against you. The 3rd tactical element required in the guard retention system is to finish every guard passing sequence in an offensive cycle. It is very difficult for you to retain guard against persistent combination passing attempts. You must be able to take the fight back to your opponent so that he's just as worried about your offense from guard as you are about his passing from top. Just as it's very difficult to stop a good puncher from hitting you merely by dodging and slipping and rolling without firing punches back yourself, so too it's very tough to stop a good guard passer who's combining passing attempts together and working relentlessly to work around your legs. At some point, you've got to take the fight back to your opponent. So my advice to you, on a tactical level, at the completion of every guard retention sequence, finish in an offensive cycle. This requires you to re-establish a strong connection to your opponent that enables you to keep aligned with them. My recommendation, especially at fundamental levels, is to use more than anything else a cross-collar and sleeve cuff grip on your opponent's upper body, and to place a foot on your opponent's hip and the other foot on the bicep. This immediately establishes great control of your opponent's head and posture, enables you to maintain center line with your opponent by developing a strong connection. It's a great way for you to enter into the various attacks from bottom position, and it works equally well on both standing and kneeling opponents. And so I always recommend at the closing of every guard retention system, try to finish with a strong connection to your opponent, and if possible, the cross-collar and sleeve cuff grip sequence. We'll be spending a lot of time on this as the video progresses. So at this point, we've got 3 tactical skills and 3 physical skills. The next element of the guard retention system is error avoidance. The sad truth is that most guard passes are highly preventable, and very often, especially at beginner level jiu-jitsu, most of the guard passes one sees are the result of what we might call unforced errors. Most guard passes, in this sense, are self-inflicted woes. The 2 most destructive errors that I see in beginning students are chest exposure and head exposure. If your elbows and knees drift apart and you expose your chest to your opponent, you massively increase the chances of your opponent passing your guard at any given moment. In addition, if you enable your opponent to control your head, you have done yourself a great disservice. Much of what we do with regards our framing skills is designed to get around these 2 critical areas of guard retention, chest exposure and head exposure. And I want you paying strong attention to your posture and your framing to get around these two critical errors. In summary now, let's look at the various key elements of our general guard retention system. These are 3 physical skills of posture, body movement, and framing. 3 tactical skills of threat assessment, appropriate level of response, and finishing in an offensive cycle. And an admonition towards error avoidance. We must avoid chest exposure and head exposure. With this in mind, we can now state a very simple 4-step heuristic guard retention system. Step number 1, identify the threat level of the pass being used against us based upon the various demarcation lines of the body and of the 5 steps of guard passing. Understand that the jeopardy point is your fundamental measure of threat level. Secondly, respond with the appropriate level of guard retention response using the various 3 frames that we propose and the 10 body movements which form the core of guard retention skill. The 3rd step is to recover our legs and recover our center line with our opponent's center line. And the 4th and final step is to finish in an offensive cycle, where I recommend the cross collar and cuff grip upon your opponent. So 4 steps to this simple heuristic system. Identify the threat level, respond with the appropriate level of response, recover legs and center line, and then 4th and finally, finish in an offensive cycle. In most cases, cross collar and cuff grips. If that's the general guard retention system, what about specific systems of retaining guard? These are the traditional methods. Well, I identify 6 main forms of guard passing method, which are used in the modern sport of jiu-jitsu. Of course, there are many others, but these form the vast majority of successful guard passes in modern day jiu-jitsu. These are double under guard passes, where my opponent gets underneath both of my legs with scoop grips and works to pass my guard. Over under guard passes, where one arm goes under my leg, one arm goes over, and my opponent works to pass my guard. Toreando passes, where we get grips on our opponent's legs, misdirect the legs while stepping out to an angle and passing. Leg drag guard passes, where 2 feet are taken to one side of my body, and we work to pass from that position. Knee slicing guard passes, where I use a knee to slice across one of my opponent's thighs and into strong side positions. And the 6th, long step guard passing, where we gain head control over our training partner and step out to our opponent's shoulder line while holding onto a leg so that we can pass. These 6 forms of guard pass constitute the vast majority of successful passes in modern day jiu-jitsu competition. It is therefore very much worth our time to spend training time and development on identifying these guard passes, their specific strengths and weaknesses, and identifying useful moves to overcome them, negate them, so we can retain our guard in the face of their use. So our general approach to guard retention goes in 2 different directions. The general system, the one I want you spending most of your time on, and these specific scenarios where we identify the 6 main forms of guard passes used in modern day competition and how to negate those. I want to start by looking at the idea of a quick overview of the guard retention system that I want you to focus on. This video will present a lot of information about guard retention, but it would be nice to start off with a quick summary of the bullet points, so to speak, of what I want you focusing on as you develop your skills of guard retention. Whenever we go to retain our guard, there's 2 basic philosophies that get preached as to how you're going to retain guard against a strong passer. Probably the most common and historically the most important one has been a move for move approach, where you understand guard retention in terms of your opponent uses a specific guard pass and you use a specific counter to that pass. So your first job is to identify what is the guard pass my opponent is using. There are different forms of guard pass, obviously. And once you assess, okay, it's guard pass A, then I will bring in counters to that specific guard pass. So if someone uses, for example, a knee slice guard pass, I will identify the various strong points of a knee slice. I will try to negate those strong points and then counter along the lines of the weak points of that particular guard pass. This is a kind of a move for move philosophy. You identify the move being used against you and you bring in specific moves to counter that specific move. There's nothing wrong with that approach. It's a good, strong, time-honored approach, and it works well. I will be teaching aspects of that approach later on in the video. However, as a general rule, I prefer to see my students use a more conceptual or principle-based approach to guard passing, where instead of focusing on what should I do to one particular form of guard pass, I like to give general considerations based around distance and body movement so that they can use these against any form of guard pass. So there's no longer a need to cleanly identify what is the guard pass being used against me and bring in specific counters to a specific move. Rather, we look at the idea of where is my opponent positioned, how far is the distance between he and myself, and we bring in various kinds of body movements and physical skills to stop any form of guard pass rather than one specific form. I've always believed this is the better way to teach guard retention for a simple reason. Guard passing is a fast, dynamic part of the sport of jiu-jitsu where there's a lot of movement, lots of changes in directions, a lot of subterfuge and confusion. In a chaotic atmosphere like that, it's very difficult to just use specific counters to specific moves and get a lot of success. Rather, I find students do much better when they have a broad-based principle or conceptual approach, where they tend to identify what is the distance in the relationship between myself and my opponent and use an approach that will work against any form of guard pass rather than one specific one. So that's the direction I'm going to take this brief introduction. We're going to start off looking at the idea of what is necessary for someone to pass my guard. Okay, once you have a clear understanding of what my opponent needs to do to pass my guard, then we're going to develop a very clear understanding of what we need to do to shut that down. I'm going to start off by saying there are 6 fundamental conditions that your opponent must satisfy if he is to pass your guard. If he doesn't satisfy all 6, he will never pass your guard. The idea is that if we know what these 6 conditions are, we can fight each one of those 6 conditions along the way. Please understand that these 6 conditions are roughly sequential. Sometimes the sequence changes a little, but they're broadly sequential. The further into the sequence your opponent goes, the more the threat level of a guard pass rises. Okay, so if he's only completed 1 of the 6, there's not a lot of danger. 2 of the 6, a little more, but still things are manageable. But by the time the guy gets down to the 5th or 6th conditions, you're in a crisis situation, and your response will have to be a lot more extreme than it would against an early threat. So with that in mind, let's look at what are the fundamental 6 conditions that my opponent must satisfy in order to pass my guard. Okay, first things first, your opponent is going to have to break whatever kind of connection that you have to him. Okay, if I have no connection to my opponent, I'm just here on my back, then it's a very easy thing for him to start maneuvering around my legs and form advantageous angles on me, and then close distance and pass my guard. That changes when I start getting grips and connection with my training partner. Okay, the kind of connection that I'm most interested in seeing you guys develop is what we call the 4 points of connection, where I use my feet, both feet, and both hands to form strong connections to my opponent. Okay, for example, I could connect with my opponent's upper body like so. Here, all 4 of my limbs, both feet and both hands, have formed a strong connection to my opponent's upper body. I've chosen the connection to be at my opponent's upper body. If my opponent went to walk around me now and form an angle, you would see that he would be unable to do so because the connection I have to him is sufficiently strong that wherever he goes, I go with him. Okay, this connection could also be at the lower body. Okay, here I've chosen a different form of connection, and we lock up like so. And once again, as my opponent goes to walk around behind me, all four of my limbs are connected to my opponent in a way where it's very difficult for him to form any kind of angular change. This starts to change a little when my opponent starts breaking connections. Say, for example, I had feet in my training partner's biceps, okay, a fairly standard form of guard. If he snapped my feet down and moved his feet back, now I have only 2 points of connection to him. Only my two hands. My feet have lost the connection. So when my opponent goes to form an angle now, it's pretty damn easy for him. And as a result, he can come in, close distance, and use that advantageous angle to start threatening guard passes. Okay. Similarly, if I'm here on my training partner's legs, if he stepped back now and took my feet off, again, I only have 2 points of connection now. And as a result, it's very easy for him to start forming advantageous angles, closing distance, and passing my guard. So you will see that the first condition that my opponent must satisfy in order to begin a passing sequence is to break my connection down from 4 points of connection to something less, 2, 1, and best of all, no points of connection. If my opponent can do that, he puts me into a defensive cycle. That's where the defensive cycle starts, where he can start initiating guard passes, and he's satisfied his first condition for guard passing. The second condition, and the first and the second sometimes interchange. Sometimes one comes before the other. So this is not a hard part of the sequence. My opponent must have some kind of grip on me. Okay, my opponent has no grips on me whatsoever. It's very easy for me as he moves to an angle to simply follow him. He moves to an angle, and we can follow very easily. So your opponent has to have some kind of working grip upon you. In the majority of cases, at least one of your opponent's hands must be on your legs. Okay, he can have one hand on my upper body, but the other hand has to be on a leg. In many cases, he will have two hands on the legs, either controlling the gi or controlling the feet. In some cases, controlling the hips, going underneath like so, but they all have in common hands on legs or hips to some degree. Okay, so your opponent must have some kind of grip upon you. So when my opponent grips up, from here, this is where the action starts. You can see that he's reduced me to 2 points of contact, and he has a good working grip, and as a result, he's able now to start going into the next phases of the guard pass. Okay, so you can clearly see now we have two initial conditions. Your opponent's got to break those 4 points of connection, and he has to get a solid working grip upon you in order to start the action of passing guard. Once these two have been satisfied, then things start getting interesting. Your opponent now must go in and start the actions of forming angle and closing distance. Okay. If my opponent, just no grips on me, just closed distance on me, if he just came in, that would be worthless, okay, because he's actually given me all forms of attack now, okay? If my opponent just formed an angle and just walked out to an angle, that too would be useless, because it's so easy for me just to correct the angle and recover. Angle and distance typically work together. Your opponent wants to get an angle and close distance at the same time. And when he can do this, you've got a serious problem on your hands. Okay. Now your opponent has gotten to a position where he's essentially past your legs. Okay. And now this is where things start getting interesting. Once your opponent has passed the legs, he's covered 4 of the essential elements of guard passing. He's broken the 4 points of connection. He's got a satisfactory working grip upon you, and he's closed distance and angle. The next 5th element is the idea of level change. As my opponent is initially up here, at some point he's going to have to come down and level. He has a choice between coming down with his chest. That's the most popular choice by far. But he also has the choice of coming down with a knee to my stomach or chest. Okay, and this too is an effective means of operating. In the majority of cases, the chest-to-chest position is far more controlling, so most of your opponents are probably going to favor this. But if your opponent can now level change, he will go down into the 5th element of guard passing, and from here he now must progress to the 6th and final one. This is the idea of a finishing pin. Now, the idea of a pin here is that my opponent must hold one of my shoulders down to the mat for at least 3 seconds. This means he must go from my lower body, my legs, to my head. And so the final phase involves what we call a cranial shift, where my opponent's hand must go to control my head. Then the other arm must come down to form a wedge on the far side of the body, and one of my shoulders must be held down to the mat for roughly 3 seconds, and if that should occur, your opponent has passed your guard. Okay, so you can see there are 6 essential features of most forms of guard pass, which your opponent must satisfy if he is to pass your guard. Let's quickly run through them again. First things first, if I have 4 points of connection on my training partner, a solid form of attack in these kinds of situations, no one's going to pass your guard as long as you've got those 4 points of connection. As he goes to walk around you now, you're connected. And as a result, this is a very, very strong and robust position for us to hold someone. But the moment he starts clearing those points of connections off, okay, now problems are starting. Okay, so he's got to first break the 4 points of connection. He's got to get a solid working grip. Here he's opted for a lapel on one side, pants on the other. And then from here he needs to start working with distance and angle. As he gets angle and distance and manipulates them together, he comes into the 5th element, the idea of a level change, where his chest comes down to my chest. And then from here, the cranial shift, where he comes up and controls my head. And from this position, if he can hold one of my shoulders down for 3 seconds or more, he will now have passed my guard. Okay? So once we understand guard passing as a set of 6 essential conditions, we know now what we need to fight against. Essentially, the act of guard retention is to fight my opponent along all of those 6 elements, every step of the way. The understanding is that the further into those 6 elements he gets, the more danger he represents to me as the guard passer. In addition to these 6 elements, there are also considerations with regards to our behavior. We know what he needs to do. Now we have to start understanding what are we going to do in response to this. The big guide that I want to give you, and in my opinion, this is the heart and soul of this video, is to give you a very useful, very simple, and very practical guide as to how you're going to behave in the face of those 6 guard passing conditions. What I want to do is give you a crystal clear, very workable, very simple to understand system of distancing and angle so that you know how you should be reacting in response to the various threats that are working against you. Let's start off with Mateus lying down, and I want you to understand his body in terms of a set of demarcation lines. Once you understand these demarcation lines, you'll have a clear sense of where you and he ought to be moving at any given stage in a guard passing scenario. We have an opponent with legs up in a supine position. The first line that I want you guys to focus on is your opponent's toe line, the line that joins our training partner's 2 toes, just like so. Okay. As a general rule, when someone goes to approach a guard passing scenario, the first thing that they must take into account is that toe line. That's where they're going to approach their opponent. I can't be naive in the way I approach. If I just step right into my opponent's toe line, I've given him a distance now where he can form 4 points of connection. And as a result, I'm now the defensive player, even though I'm on top. Okay, once he gets 4 points of connection, he can start off balancing me and he can start attacking me. This is true regardless of whether I step outside his legs, in which case he might go into, say, for example, Ashigarami variations, or whether I step inside his legs, in which case he might go into De La Riva variations or what have you. Okay, so the first thing I've got to do is I've got to work outside of my training partner's toe line. Okay, from my opponent's perspective, a second demarcation line that's very important to him is the relationship between his knee line and his hip line. As a general rule, unless he has 4 points of contact, my opponent always wants his knee line to be above his hip line. If his knee line starts going below his hip line, his legs get extended in ways that make it very, very easy for me to start going into guard passes. Extended legs are very easy legs to pass. Retracted legs, where the knees are well up above the hip line, are very difficult to pass. Okay, so as a general rule, my opponent, the man down on the floor, must always keep he must monitor at all times the relationship between his knee line and his hip line. And unless he has 4 points of contact to hold me in place, he wants to make damn sure his knee line is higher than the hip line. The moment that relationship starts going south, it's very, very easy for me now to start going into strong guard passing positions. Okay? Now, the most important demarcation line, and the one I want you focusing on the most in all your guard passing and guard retention studies, is the hip line. The hip line represents a fundamental measure where if I can get past the line of the hips, that essentially means I've passed my opponent's legs. That doesn't mean you've passed your opponent's guard, but it is a very positive sign of progress. You're going in all the right directions. So always in these situations, I'm looking to get either a knee or a foot up to that hip line. Okay. In addition to the hip line, if you post them in, there is a final line of demarcation, also very important. This is the shoulder line. Okay, the shoulder line represents another method of guard passing where I can move around beyond my opponent's shoulder line and use north-south positions as a final passing position. This too is going to become very important when we start to look at guard passing. Now, all the lines that we've looked at so far were horizontal lines: shoulder line, hip line, knee line, and toe line. There are also three critical vertical lines of the body. The first is well known to everybody. This is the center line. That's the line that runs right down the center of my training partner's body. As a general rule, the man retaining the guard is always looking to hold me in line with his center line. If I start moving away from his center line, it's a bad thing for him and a good thing for me. So he's always going to be looking to correct himself and realign the center line. The finishing sequence of every guard retention should be center line to center line. Okay, the minute I start moving away from the center line, it's bad for him. Now he starts to see he needs to come back now and get his center line realigned with my own. In addition to a center line, my opponent has two sidelines. The sideline is the line that runs from his shoulder to his hip, and obviously he has a left and a right sideline. The importance of the sideline is that it intersects with the hip line. And the most important thing that you must understand about this theory of demarcation is that the intersection point of the hip line and the sideline, this point we call the jeopardy point, is the single most important measure of distance and angle in the entire guard pass versus guard retention game. Our whole goal is to get to the intersection point of the sideline and the hip line, this point here. I want either my foot or my knee on this point. I want it there as quickly and as often as possible. I want to do all of my guard passing work as much as I can from that point, regardless of the guard pass that I employ. So from a situation where I'm working here with my training partner and I break the 4 points of connection, our whole thing is quickly to get to positions like so. Okay, I am now in a position where my opponent is 100% defensive. I have not passed my opponent's guard yet, but I've made damn good progress. By getting to this jeopardy point, the intersection of my opponent's sideline and hip line, I'm now in the commander's seat. Now he's 100% defensive and must fight hard to create frames to recover his legs. And I can work off that in many different ways to go into many different chains of guard pass and pass from one side to the other, etc., etc. So our whole thing as the guard passer is to fight from that position. As the guard retainer, this jeopardy point is the fundamental measure by which you will start creating your various defensive behaviors, which will hopefully result in you retaining your guard against a strong passer. Understand something. Once your opponent breaks that 4 points of connection, things happen quickly. You can go from a situation where you're lined up center line to center line and everything seems fine, and then half a second later he's right on that jeopardy point and you're staring down the barrel of points being scored on you. Things happen quickly in guard passing. It's a fast, dynamic part of the sport. And it's very, very useful for you to use this jeopardy point as your fundamental measure as to what you should be looking to do, how you should be looking to behave from the perspective of the guard retainer. Okay. Now, with that in mind, we can start going forward and start giving you some practical techniques and body movements, which are going to make you a difficult guard to pass. Okay. So we know what he wants to do. He's got to satisfy 6 fundamental conditions to pass my guard. We know now that we measure distance and angle in terms of various demarcation lines that run through and across the human body. We know that the most important one is the so-called jeopardy spot, the intersection of the sideline and the hip line. With that in mind, let's start looking now at the nuts and bolts of retaining guard. Okay, first things first. There are a number of simple body movements which are going to be required on your part to be a successful guard retainer. I'm just going to demonstrate them solo first, Mateus. There are a small set of moves which are responsible for most successful acts of guard retention. You will have to master these moves. There's no shortcut around this. If you are unable currently to perform these moves, you are going to find it difficult to retain your guard against a strong passer. The good news is these moves are all very easy to learn. I'm a 52-year-old man with a broken hip and a crippled leg. If I can do this, you can do this very easily. Let's have a look at what these movements are, and then we'll bring Mateus back in to actually demonstrate them being used. But first, I want you to focus on the movements themselves. Remember, guys, a constant theme of all the videos I teach, you can't perform moves until you can perform the prerequisite body movements that underlie them. Okay, movement always comes before moves. So with that in mind, first and most fundamental body movement that we must master is the simplest one. This is the act of pommeling our legs. Okay, we have to be able to take our legs and pommel them in circles in both directions. Notice that when we pommel legs, it's not just the feet moving, it's also the hips moving side to side as the knees pump back and forth, the hips move side to side, and the feet circle. And when all of those combine together, we can easily pommel our legs in both directions around our opponent's arms. This will be a very useful body movement. We'll demonstrate its practical applications very soon. In addition, we must be able to shrimp. Okay, there are many forms of shrimping, but the two main ones for the act of guard retention are sliding shrimps, where someone moves to an angle and we slide our body out, just like so. This can be done with greater and lesser effect. Sometimes when we shrimp, we move quite long distances. Other times it's sufficient just to move just enough to get the angle recovered. Okay. Now, in addition to shrimping forwards, we also have to be able to shrimp back and away from our opponent. We just demonstrated the idea of moving away. We also have to master a reverse shrimp, where I place a foot and I pull myself forwards towards my opponent. And these two methods, pushing away and a pulling forwards, are both critical for your ability to retain guard. Don't worry, I'll give you practical demonstrations very soon. In addition to shrimping, we must master the act of heisting. Okay, there are two main forms of heisting. Hip heisting involves a situation where I'm sitting on my hips, and from here I usually have a frame hand on my opponent, and I go from a seated position to a kneeling position. This gives us an ability to cover long distances, to get further away from our opponent, and to change angle on our opponent. It also results obviously in a level change. Here I'm fairly short, close to the ground, but when I come up to a knee, we get height advantage over an opponent, and from here this is often a very, very useful act to enable us to retain guard. In addition to hip heisting, we also have to work with back heisting. Sometimes we're in a supine position on our back, we still have to be able to heist. In these situations, we turn onto our side, normally with the benefit of an underhook, and from here we heist up to our knees so that we can go in and ultimately retain a guard, go back to guard off the heist. So this is very, very important. Usually off the underhook, we turn onto our side, elbow comes back, and then from this position, we come up. And now from a position like this, we can always go back into guard. As you probably have figured out, the action of sitting is also part of it. Whenever we are on our knees in a turtle position, for example, we should always be able to sit back into a guard position. Typically, the act of sitting, the most important element is that my head is always very close to the ground. If my head is up like this, it's not really realistic. Typically, in a turtle position, our opponent's body weight is on top of us. So our head must move close to the floor, and as a result, we can quickly sit and put an opponent back in guard. We should be able to do it when our opponent's in front of us. Or if our opponent's out to a side, we simply sit and put them back in guard like so. Other critical body movements. Arguably the most important one of all, and we'll be spending a lot of time on this, is the act of scissoring our legs. Okay, as someone goes to pass one of my legs, the other leg is responsible for retaining guard. So as my right leg gets passed, my left leg must come over and compensate for the failure of the right. And then if he switches sides on me, now he's passing my left leg. Now my right leg has to make up for the failure of the left and come over and pass. And so we get side-to-side action where one leg scissors over the other. And as a result, as my opponent passes one of my legs, the other must compensate and make up for the failure of the other leg. In this way, we can move very, very smoothly into a scissored leg action. The idea behind a scissor, where we spend a lot of time on the scissoring motion, is that it puts one leg between myself and my opponent. So as my opponent passes one of my legs, the other recovers, puts a barrier between my chest and his chest, and we go into recover guard. There are numerous other forms of body movement associated with the position. One is the act of pendulum action of our legs, where very often we will have to use our legs in a pendulum motion, and as a result, we'll be able to sit up and come up into positions where we pommel off our training partner's guard pass and come up to a seated position. This is closely related to another body movement where we come up and prop onto an elbow. I picture a line that goes across my shoulders, the so-called shoulder line. My arms go across the shoulder line, and as a result, we can come up first to an elbow and then to a hand, and we can bring our back off the floor. Done in this fashion, we can go from a situation where we're pinned down on the floor to one where our shoulders come off the mat. And remember, if our shoulders are off the mat, then there's no danger of our opponent completing a guard pass by pinning one of our shoulders to the mat. So this too will become very important. Another critical body movement that you must begin to master is the act of rolling over a shoulder. My opponent, as he goes to pass, will often force me into a turtle position. And from turtle position, we're expected to be able to put a shoulder down on the side that our opponent is on, roll by bringing our head inside our own knees, and as a result, I can bring my legs back between myself and my opponent and put them back in guard. So shoulder rolling represents one of the most important ways in which we can bring our legs as a barrier back between ourselves and our opponent. And ultimately, guys, every act of guard retention is just that. You lose the barrier of your legs between yourself and your opponent. You lose it temporarily and use a body movement to recover it. So it's here. My opponent moves around behind me. There's a danger of him taking my back. Just roll through. Now my legs come back between myself and my opponent, and we're back in the driver's seat. Closely related to the idea of shoulder rolling is the idea of inversion. And inversion will be a big, big part of your ability to retain a guard against a strong passer. Typically, we start the act of inversion in a seated situation. We put one foot underneath the other, and as a result, we're able now to invert up onto our two shoulders, roll through, and once again our head goes between our two knees, and as a result we can bring our legs between ourselves and our opponent and re-establish a guard position for bottom. So once again, this is typically drilled in a seated situation. One foot goes across under the other as a two-leg scissor. We go down to a shoulder, push off the bottom foot, and put our head between our own knees. And then from this position I can play from an inverted position to hopefully put my opponent back in guard. Inversion can often make us move 180 degrees. I'm currently facing west. I can invert my body, touch my foot on the floor, and now face east. Okay? So every time we're facing a given direction, our opponent comes around beyond the shoulder line and starts passing, we can form frames in front of our opponent. We invert, touch, and use either his body or the floor to turn 180 degrees and hopefully put someone back in guard. In the long version of the introduction, and indeed the heart of the video itself, I'll be spending a lot of time on these various body movements. There are a few more of them that I'll cover in there, but those are the main ones I want you to focus on. Those are the most important for most aspects of guard retention. Let's quickly just show how they work with an actual training partner in front of us. Okay, let's first look at the idea of pommeling. My opponent's on two knees, and from here starts reaching underneath my legs. Whenever we see this kind of thing going on, the act of pommeling, every time he goes to reach under, enables us to pommel away from our opponent's grips. If my opponent grabs Toreando grips in here like so, it's up to us to be able to take a foot and pommel over the top of our training partner's legs and form some kind of connection with our training partner. Now when he goes to throw my legs by and pass, I get connected with, once again, I've got the 4 points of connection and we're locked up. Whenever we want to go into counter offense from situations like this, it's all done out of pommeling. My ability to move my feet around my opponent's hands and arms and work effectively from bottom position. The idea of a pendulum. My opponent goes underneath the leg like so, a very common form of guard pass. As he starts pushing into me and driving, we can use a pendulum action to come up and push on our training partner's arm and recover our training partner's recover our guard just like so. The idea of shrimping. My training partner's here in front of me and starts to form an angle on me from this position. We can shrimp, create room and space, and then from here either come up to our knees or put our training partner back in guard and recover angle. There's so many ways in which we can use these fundamental body movements, okay? My opponent stands up, starts running around behind me in a seated position. As he comes around to pass my guard, we can use inversion in these situations. Push, roll, and put our training partner back in guard. So these are how all of these various body movements are used to retain guard will be covered as we go further into the video. But I just want to give you a brief little introduction there to the idea of body movement and how it pertains to the action of guard recovery. So what have we got so far? We've got this critical idea that my opponent needs 6 elements to pass my guard. These 6 go in a rough sequence, and the further into the 6 my opponent goes, the more dangerous he becomes to me, the closer he is to finally passing me. And it all culminates in the idea of putting one of my shoulders down on the mat and pinning me for 3 seconds to score points. We've seen our way of fighting against this, how to fight against all those 6 elements that he requires to pass my guard, begins with insight. And that insight is bound up with the notion of distance and angle. We gave you a theory of demarcation lines of the human body and how we can use these lines to gain a very clear understanding of when we're in danger and when we're not. We've seen the simplest and the most important rubric for when you're in danger is the so-called jeopardy point, the intersection of the hip line and the sideline. When your opponent gets to that point, there's something of a crisis starting to emerge. It's not over yet. You can still defend yourself from there. But now it's time to go into a very much a defensive mode where you're now thinking about how am I going to act to retain my guard. The basis of guard retention is body movement. Okay, but there are some other skills you must learn now. The most important one is probably going to be the act of framing. A watchword or mantra that I often use with my students is this: just because someone has passed your legs doesn't mean they've passed your guard. Your guard is much more than just your legs. Yes, the legs are the centerpiece of the guard. The legs are the horsepower, the strong element of the guard. But the guard position is a 5-limbed animal, not a 2-limbed animal. You also have your arms and your head to help guard retention. Use them. You're going to need it, because it's pretty damn easy for a skilled opponent to pass your legs. It's not that difficult, as we've seen. The moment we break the 4 points of connection and we reduce them to 2 points of connection, it doesn't take a lot from here to go straight through into that jeopardy point. And it can all happen very, very quickly, okay? My general contention is you're in a defensive position the second your opponent breaks the 4 points of connection. And it can go from 0 to 60 in a very short period of time. It's important, therefore, we know how to manage this idea of the jeopardy point. What are we going to do? Your first thing to do there is to create a set of frames with your arms. Now, framing is a very important skill, and there are more, but there are 3 basic ranges of framing that I want you to work with. There are arm's length, half arm's length, and no arm's length. Okay, these are forehand frames where I use my hand to frame on my opponent. I can use one hand or 2. There are forearm frames where I use my elbows and forearms to frame on people. These are shorter range but stronger. And there are backhand frames where I put my back hand to my opponent on my head and my heart. And as a result, I can hold them off. Okay, so let's look at a situation where Mateus is on 2 knees and he blows past my legs and he gets to the jeopardy point. Our whole thing now is to start forming frames. Here, I've used a forehand frame right at the bicep, just like so. So when he goes up to control my head and switch to the upper body, it's difficult. Now our whole thing is to use a scissoring action to bring our foot to our own hand. This creates what we call the scissor guard, where one leg is over the other in a scissor action like so. When he tries to close distance now, he just goes onto my legs. I can easily manage this. I can even push back, create space, and ultimately create a situation we put our opponent back in guard, and now we can get 4 points of connection established once again. You can do this with one hand, you can do it with two, okay? But ultimately, the frame is about creating an emergency barrier which gives us enough time to bring the legs back in and re-establish angle. Now, we come back center line to center line, and our whole thing is to go back. So 4 points of connection, and now we're ready to start attacking again. Now, if my opponent gets a little closer to me, the forehand frame may not be possible. And now we have to go to a closer frame, the forearm frame. Again, he blows past my legs, and we come in and we catch our training partner here on the forearms. And just like before, we're always looking to bring the legs over and establish the scissor guard. If it turns out that my opponent gets sufficiently close that my forearm frame will make the scissor guard difficult on the side he's passing, we can always use a reverse shrimping motion to come out the back door and form a scissor guard on the other side of the body. And as a result, we can now realign center line to center line and find ourselves back, 4 points of connection, and ready to play. The scariest situations are where your opponent gets through, level changes all the way down, and goes beyond your forehand and your forearm frames. Now you've got to start using backhand frames. When he blows past in these situations, I put hands on head, hands on heart. And when he comes into close distance, yes, he does get kind of a chest-to-chest contact, but my hands are a barrier. So he never really controls my head because my hand is inside, has the inside position, and my forearm is inside his chest. And as a result, I can use, say for example, a scissoring action to re-establish guard. And now from here, we're back with 4 points of connection and ready to play. So you can see that this idea of framing is absolutely critical. Whenever your legs are beaten, it's going to come down to your ability to frame with your hands and head, which are going to make the difference and enable you to retain your guard. That's why we always come back to this saying, just because someone has passed your legs doesn't mean they've passed your guard. Okay? Passing the legs isn't that difficult for a skilled opponent, but passing your guard should always be difficult. That's where those hand frames come in. Now, the most important frame that I'm going to try my best to convince you guys to work with throughout this video is always going to be a frame which involves my training partner's gi. Okay? The best one, generally, is a cross collar frame, but it's also permissible to use a straight collar frame too. We favor these ones the most for a simple reason. These frames are much more robust and sticky to your opponent than simply putting hands on your opponent like so. The gi, by its very nature, puts a rope around our training partner's neck. And when he tries to drive forward, even if my hand slips, it will create space that's very difficult for my opponent to get past. And as a result, these are very strong and very robust frames, much more robust than simply putting a hand on somebody. Now, even when Mateus runs all the way around behind me, it's pretty easy for me to realign my body with his. And then from here, we go right back into 4 points of connection, and we're ready to play again. So as a general rule, when we work from bottom position, I like to see my students working here with cross lapel grips like so. Even if Mateus runs all the way around behind me now, from here we can hold him off long enough. It's not a difficult thing for us to roll through, and then from here we cover our legs and find ourselves back with 4 points of connection. So as a general rule, we play between two major kinds of frames. The most robust frames are those which employ our training partner's lapels, either straight or cross. Usually it's a cross grip in the majority of cases. However, if I feel those have been lost, then we can always go to hands-on frames, either with one hand or two hand. Okay? So those are the main framing skills that we work with. Bear in mind that the moment your opponent gets to that jeopardy point, the intersection of the hip line and the sideline, it's going to come down to your ability to frame. He's past your legs, but he's not past your guard. And that frame represents the second tier of your guard. As the legs get beaten, the hands and the head kick in. In addition to the skills of framing, we also want to bring in the skills of gripping. As you probably guessed, one of our favorite grips here is going to be cross lapel. That's an incredibly useful grip in general from bottom position and for guard retention in particular. This gives us a unique ability to both pull and to push. Okay, if I just put a hand on someone, I can only push. I can't pull with this grip. I can only push. But here, I can both push and pull with equal efficacy. So it's equally good for both offense and defense. It's an incredibly useful means of gripping. The two major grips that I want you focusing on and using, especially at fundamentals level, and you will use these throughout your career in jiu-jitsu all the way up to black belt and beyond, are double cuff grips and the cross cuff foot in the bicep. Okay, the number one grip all round for both defensive and offensive purposes when we work with a jacket will be a cuff grip, like so, a cross collar grip, like so, a foot on the hip on the same side, and a foot on the bicep on the other. Okay, just open your body. So we're in just like so. Okay, this gives me 4 points of connection. The cross lapel grip means that if my opponent goes to pull away from me, it's shockingly difficult. You can draw him in very easily. It's a very strong pulling grip. The foot here in the bicep gives me inside position. So when he tries to establish grips on my legs to pass my guard, he's very limited in what he can do. When he tries to establish grips with the other hand, I monitor his grips. If he wanted to switch to another grip now, if he wanted to switch to my pants, it'd be difficult because I'm controlling where his hand goes. The moment I get this grip, I now control where the hand is. Okay, so this is an incredibly efficient method of controlling my opponent's movement that obviously sets up many forms of attack as well as is very robust in defense. If my opponent stood up on me and backed away and pulled all of his grips out, you would still have this incredibly useful grip. So if my opponent now went to pass my guard and run around behind me, it wouldn't be that difficult for me to use it simply as a frame. And as a result, we could easily go through and maintain our guard against resistance. So this is, as it were, the all-round best grip for both retention and counter-offense out of guard. And it's the grip that I want you spending most of your time developing. If that's the best grip there is for both offense and defense, there's another grip which is a close second, and this is double cuff grip. Okay, between these two grips, the cross lapel, cuff, foot on bicep, and double cuff grips. These are the two best grips to enter into the guard retention skill development. Very often, as my opponent goes in to get grips on me here, we will work with double cuff grips. This will give us a tremendous ability to pommel feet both inside and outside our training partner's legs. You're going to get from here so many good attacking options to go through and take all manner of good, effective 4 points of connection to your opponent. If he stands up on us, we can also use this double cuff grip to go into all manner of entanglements of the legs, from outside, from inside, it doesn't matter. There's just so many ways that we can work in situations like this to tie up an opponent and control the two hands. Now, if my opponent gets into good attacking position, good passing position underneath me, this is still an incredibly strong defensive grip as well. If my opponent goes to move his hand position, I control where his hands go. If I don't monitor the hands, he can start passing quite easily from here. So when someone starts getting grips on me, I want to control where his hands go. I don't want him changing his grips to more advantageous grips. And the moment you get these two cuff grips in place, you now control where his hands go for the rest of the match. Okay? He goes to switch his grips, he can't. He goes to advance his hand across my center line, he can't. And at any given moment, I can use foot pommeling to go around the corner and start working into our attacks. So these two grips, double cuff grips and the cross collar foot and bicep grip, are without any question the two most important grips that I want you focusing on as you develop your skills in guard retention. They give an unparalleled ability to attack our opponent's posture, control the placement of his hands, prevent him from switching to other forms of guard pass, and they enable us to go from offense to defense very, very quickly and very, very smoothly. Those are the two primary grips that I want you working for developing the skill of guard retention. The last thing that I want you to focus on is a tactical consideration. There's a sense in which as beautiful and effective a skill as guard retention is, it has its limits. Just as a good boxer never gets into situations where he's only dodging punches, but rather every time he dodges a punch, he throws a punch back. There's a reason why, because you can only dodge punches so long before they start hitting. Even the most skilled defensive boxer can dodge 15, 20 punches in a row. The 21st punch is going to hit him. So too with guard retention. You can have the most beautiful body movement, the most dexterous legs, the greatest ability to pommel, invert, do all those wonderful things that enable you to hold guard for long periods of time. But if you have a determined and skilled guard passer and all you're doing is defending, at some point he's going to break through and pass your guard. The idea is not to defend forever. The idea is to defend each guard pass and then get back into an attacking situation. That means we have to understand the idea of a defensive and an offensive cycle. My contention that I made earlier in this video is that defensive cycles start much earlier than most people believe. Most people believe that a defensive cycle starts when someone gets to the jeopardy point. Okay? So if we have Mateus on top and he spins around my legs and puts his knee down here, most people say, okay, now Danaher's in a defensive cycle. Okay, now he is, because that knee's in that position. He's got to start framing. He's got to start getting legs over. He's got to go to scissor guard. He's got to do all those things. Okay, now I will grant you that definitely is a defensive position. Okay, I'm 100% defensive the minute he gets to the jeopardy point. I agree with you on that. But my contention is actually it starts earlier than that. We have Mateus standing over us. As long as I have 4 points of connection on Mateus and he tries to whip around my legs, it's very difficult for him. Those 4 points of connection make it very difficult for him to pass. But the moment Mateus breaks the 4 points of connection, my point is this. It takes nothing more than a heartbeat for Mateus to go from, stay in front of me, it takes nothing more than a heartbeat for Mateus to go from lined up with my center line, where if someone walked in the room right now and they said, who's passing whose guard, who's doing better, the guy on bottom, the guy, everyone would say, oh, they're neutral. Their center lines are locked up. Look how quickly Mateus can just whip me around the corner and go straight to jeopardy point, boom, and it's done. Okay, you went from everything okay to, oh shit, this is going terrible. Okay, it all went south in half a second. And that's exactly the nature of guard passing. Okay, I've said this before and I'll say it again. Guard passing is one of the fastest moving, most dynamic scenarios in the entire sport of jiu-jitsu. You can go from everything's fine to, holy shit, I'm about to get my guard passed in the blink of an eye. Okay, you must understand that the moment your opponent breaks the 4 points of connection, if he has any skills, if he's a good guard passer at the level I hope you guys get to, it can all happen very, very quickly. He's on the jeopardy point and you're in trouble. So what I like to see is the moment I lose the 4 points of connection, I'm already thinking I'm in a defensive cycle. So at this point, the minute I see someone come around the corner, I'm already monitoring the hand so that when he gets to the jeopardy point and tries to transition to my head, I'm in the perfect position now to go in. And as a result, I can now reestablish 4 points of connection and we're ready to play again. The earlier you understand when you're in a defensive cycle, the easier it's going to be to defend yourself. The hardest things to defend are the things you don't see coming. But when you have anticipation on your side, you're going to find guard retention is a hell of a lot easier. Understand this. The defensive cycle begins the moment you've lost 4 points of connection. Act that way, and you're going to find guard retention is a lot easier. Now, a watchword which I use with my students. Every time you successfully retain your guard, don't congratulate yourself, don't think it's over until you get back in an offensive cycle. Just as a good boxer never just dodges punches, but every time he dodges, he hits, so too a good guard retainer doesn't just retain guard, he retains guard and gets right back into an offensive cycle. How do you measure that? By 4 points of connection. So, my training partner comes through, does a fine job of going around the corner, and starts to pass. We use any one of the various body movements that we looked at to come up, and we find ourselves now in a situation where we've got 4 points of connection. I didn't just put my opponent back in guard. I put him back in guard where now, who's the defensive player now? Who's the offensive player now? It's all changed, okay?